Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And on behalf of the Three Counties Defence and Security Group, may I wish you a warm welcome to today's webinar, and which is titled A Deep Dive into the Russian Invasion of Ukraine and the Implications and Response from the West. Just before we start, please do be aware that the seminar is being recorded. I'll return to that shortly. My name is Richard Hopkins. I'm from Waymarker Financial, and I'm one of the 5 volunteer partners who run the 3 CDSG, or the group. And we do that on behalf of the members. Alongside me today, the other volunteer partners are Sam Lewis from Hereford, New Model in Technology and Engineering, or NMITE, and who will shortly introduce our speakers. In the background, managing the IT and coordinating the questions, are Lisa O'Neill, also from NMITE, Rebecca Kirk from Harrison Clark Rickerbys Solicitors, and the group CEO, Anna Roby-Welford from Altiora Marketing. 3CDSG is a not-for-profit organisation. We aim to bring businesses in the defence and security sector together to collaborate, and in doing so, support economic development of the sector and locally, and support service charities, small businesses and veterans along the way. Our sister organisation is the Three Counties Defence and Security Exhibition, and the group provides a network and events such as this through the year to provide the opportunity to keep topics alive and members connected. After today's, the next couple of events can be found on our website, and we will be posting this out today in today's comments as well. These are an online webinar on the 9th of March, starting at 2 p.m. That one will be titled Emerging Technologies to Enable Operations from 2025 onwards. There'll be speakers there from Lockheed Martin and Paradigm, and also an update on the development of the group into the regional defence and security cluster, which might be something you've heard a little bit about. We have a face-to-face seminar scheduled for the 31st of March, and which will take place in Hereford. That's starting at 4 p.m. and running through till 7 p.m. That seminar will focus on export business, and we've got speakers from UK Export Finance, Department of International Trade, and Australia House coming to talk about sort of macro down to country specific topics. And we've also got one of our members, Level Peaks, will also be on the panel, and they'll be talking about their own experience of export work. Looking a little bit further ahead, the exhibition itself is in November, the first day of which will be the MOD Special Projects Industry Day, and that's taking place on Wednesday the 2nd of November. And then the expo and the conference will take place on Thursday the 3rd of November at the Three Counties Showground in Worcestershire, and inquiries can be made for that by emailing Anna at 3cdse.co.uk, and we'll put that email in the comments as well. Okay, so returning to today's seminar, I and the other partners provide pro bono support, and as I've said, we're a not-for-profit organisation. Members attend our events free of charge, but today, for today's seminar, we've waived any non-membership delegate fees to attend. And so what we would like to do is encourage you to, instead of paying for today's webinar, make a donation to the charities that are supporting the Ukrainian people, if you're minded to do so. We put a list of those charities on our event webpage, or you can you might want to use the disaster emergency charities as a place to make a donation, which I'm sure you've heard today in the news. The government have committed to match fund up to £20 million, and you can get to them on dec.org.uk. We've also posted contact details on the website event page of various organisations which you might find useful for support if your business is affected by the events in Ukraine. If you've got links out there, then there are various websites and contact details on there of people that might be able to help you with support and advice. So on to today's webinar. As a reminder, please be aware that today's seminar is being recorded. We will email attendees with a link to the recording. If you have any questions or comments on what you're hearing, then please put them in the comments section. We'll then collate them up, and at the end of each session, field questions, and there'll be a Q&A session at the end as well. And so with that, I will hand over to Sam, who will introduce our first speaker.
Thanks, Richard. Hi, everybody. Our first speaker today, I'm pleased to welcome, is Nicholas Groffman, who is a partner and head of international team for Harrison Clark Rickerbys solicitors. So, Nicholas, I'll hand straight over to you. I'm just conscious of our timing, so don't want to miss out.
Thank you, Sam. Yeah, I'm Nicholas Groffman from the law firm HCR. It may seem surprising to say this, but most of the issues facing us in the midst of the Ukraine war are not new. Even banning a country from the SWIFT banking system is not new. That was done to Iran in 2012. The difference is the scale. Now, before 2015, I spent 16 years in China, where I first witnessed the amazing eagerness of UK and US financial service providers to try to get round sanctions and get round export controls. Now, since then, we in HCR, when we've dealt with legal matters in Ukraine, we got used to dealing with a small law firm there that kept client details on servers in Zurich, rather than dealing with a much larger firm that, to be frank, provided better service, but also posed something of a security risk, since it had large offices in Petersburg and Moscow. So many service providers have experience of dealing with the cyber threat and the other issues that are being talked about now. But as I said before, on a smaller scale, everything now is writ large. And my point about sanctions was that it is common for highly sophisticated people from the global financial sector to seek what they call a workaround for the financing of embargoed goods. But the point is that there is often no workaround. The temptation to engage in what service providers call structuring is great, but the basic lesson should be that it doesn't matter how cunningly a deal is structured, how many intermediary entities are placed between the buyer and the seller, or how tangential the relationship is. If the ultimate aim is to subvert sanctions, then liability, including criminal liability, you can go to jail for 7 years in this country, that liability can arise. Now, in 2022, when we're facing a much more aggressive series of sanctions against Russia and Belarus and of course, Crimea and Donetsk and Luhansk, then companies are generally more aware now of the risk of sanction busting because it's all in the news. Now, sanctions will impact businesses in unexpected ways. So we need to investigate counterparties to ensure they're not part invested by sanctioned companies or people. We have to do that anyway, but we will also need to be aware of any reprisals from Russia. So the Russian government has form on this. They will wish to get revenge on the countries that have imposed sanctions. In the past, that's been in the form of cyber attacks on soft targets, not hard targets. They don't want to attack hard targets such as government defense installations with actual cyber attacks. That could trigger Article 5 of the NATO treaty. Soft targets means us, means British businesses. Now, there's a misconception that it's now illegal to trade with anyone in Russia. Well, that's not true. Gas and oil are still flowing. Europeans are still paying for it under contract. Import and export contracts are in many cases unaffected by current sanctions. If you're getting your widgets made in Russia, or if you're selling yours to Russians, you might still not be affected by sanctions. The list is key, and resources for those sanctioned lists are available on the group website. UK businesses may also be affected by erosion of the rule of law, by politicians wishing to appear tough on Russia and ignoring nuance when they do so. And the idea that we should target and ostracize anyone with a Russian-sounding name or with some vague Russian connection or even a genuine Russian connection, that idea is idiotic, and it's not the British way to act like that. Businesses need to be careful in that direction too. Yesterday, we witnessed the unedifying spectacle of Bob Seeley MP reading out the names of lawyers who dare to act for large Russian businesses. He's not going to lose any political points for doing that. He was implying that somehow they're supporting Putin. Now, if MPs don't like the law as it stands, then they need to vote to change legislation. They are, after all, the lawmakers. I personally wouldn't feel very comfortable acting for people whom I know to be villains, but that's not what we're talking about. What these lawyers are doing, whether they are moral people or not, is they're showing that the UK is a rule of law country and Russia isn't. That doesn't make us weak, it makes us strong. Now, we don't just decide people are guilty unless we can prove it in courts. We don't demand that lawyers or others ignore the law and do just what MPs want them to do. We can expect to see more mob-led anti-Russian sentiment over the next month. A Russian-owned business in the UK that's been unfairly treated might have a case for a civil suit. Russian heritage individuals might have a case for hate speech, because hate speech prosecution can be on the basis of abuse directed at someone because of their nationality. Other legal issues to be aware of: force majeure clauses in contracts relating to supply of goods. And we've probably all talked about force majeure clauses in the context of COVID over the last 2 years. As a reminder, force majeure, that's a legal concept that refers to a situation when something happens that neither the buyer nor the seller could control. Hurricanes, earthquakes, wars, and so on. And the last time we discussed it, as I said, that was with COVID, when trade was affected by lockdowns and inability to supply goods. Now we have war and sanctions. War is typically covered in force majeure clauses, sanctions only sometimes. So the governing law of the contract then becomes important, because in civil law jurisdictions, such as France, China, Germany, Japan, and Russia, force majeure can be a matter of statute law. Even if it's not in the contract, it is implied into it. In common law jurisdictions, such as ours, the UK, the United States, Australia, and so on, it's all about what it says in the contract, which is why there are probably more lawyers in Anglo countries than there are in civil law countries per head. Both Russian and UK companies will be attempting, not always in good faith, to avoid debt obligations using sanctions as an excuse. And sometimes you can do that without breaching the contract, but not always. And the complexity of legal arrangements means that sometimes complying with UK law on sanctions will expose you to civil suits in other jurisdictions if the governing law is not English law. And if you ignore a civil law judgment in another jurisdiction, that could be elevated to criminal through contempt of court. If you're using a letter of credit, typically the threshold for criminal liability is very low. Companies also need to be cautious about their payment obligations generally. Are you going to be paying in advance for goods that might be sanctioned in the future? Are you sure you will receive goods that you pay for now? These are questions you need to be thinking about. Buyers and sellers in contract where pricing of goods and services depend on the price of oil and gas. You want to review the price hedging clause in those contracts, as the price of fuel is inevitably going to rise. The price of transport will also rise. We heard from a logistics expert at the London Chamber of Commerce this morning, who observed that the Polish truckers who previously serviced Western Europe will be diverted due to the war, leading to a worse logistic problem than was experienced last year with the trucking, the scarcity of truckers, which doesn't bear contemplating. But this is what the logistics expert said. The overland route to Europe, this is something that affects a lot of our clients, will also be affected. That route typically goes from China through Russia and Belarus, and then across the border at Brest into Poland. That's the gateway to Europe. Now, for many, this is purely a moral issue. For me, and I think for everybody at HCR, this is one of the few purely black and white, right or wrong geopolitical events that I've had to advise on. Like many institutions, we too are joining forces to try and work out how we can assist the Ukrainians. We're not quibbling about the niceties of who is right and wrong, which is unusual for lawyers. We like to argue the toss about everything, but not in this. But let's not forget that law matters. The detail of contracts, laws, burden of evidence, enforceable legislation, all these things matter. Otherwise, we can claim no superiority over the Russian government and Russian courts. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas. That was really interesting. Do we have any questions? I don't see any questions in the chat at the moment. No. Okay, if anybody has any questions as we move forward, please do put them into the chat and we can make sure Nicholas can come to them at the end. So moving on, I'd like to introduce Professor Adrian Kendry. Adrian is a former NATO Senior Defence Economist and Strategic Advisor, also visiting professor at NMIT. So welcome, Adrian. I will hand straight over to you.
Good afternoon. My name is Adrian Kendry, and I'd like to thank the Three Counties Defence and Security Group for inviting me to speak this afternoon on this most important topic of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and what the implications are for the West and what are the implications for the kind of responses that the West might undertake. My previous work was for nearly 15 years as the NATO Senior Defence Economist in Brussels and an advisor for the Secretary General. And after that, I have been an advisor on economic security for NATO Strategic Foresight Analysis Program, including a lot of analysis of Russia at various events I participated in. The conflict is without doubt the most serious, horrific, and gravest international crisis of the 21st century. The amount of destruction that we're seeing, the horrible scenes and the witnessing of refugees and people being bombed in their homes and shelters, these remind us of the attacks that actually took place under the Syrian president's regime, Bashar al-Assad, with Russian assistance in the cities of Aleppo and Idlib, but also elsewhere in the Crimea in 2014. The images that come out daily and the video links and the astonishing recording of people's experiences as they are under fire from Russian weapons just is almost impossible to describe. The pity and misery of the unjust war, the death and destruction that comes out of the sky. This is a picture of what has been happening in Kharkiv, the second largest city in Ukraine. And the fact that in urban areas and residential areas, death just comes out of the sky without any warning. This photo is heartbreaking for me. It shows the wonderful cathedral, Sophia Cathedral in Kyiv, during the conflict, and with snow, and everywhere is cold and snowbound. But the music that comes out of the cathedral can be absolutely wonderful and astonishing, but it's against the black backdrop of all of the violence that is visiting people in and across all of the regions of Ukraine. Of course, it's not just the people of Ukraine who are protesting about this terrible conflict and war. People all over the world are protesting, and that includes people in Russia, Russian Federation, who are absolutely outraged by this attack, unprovoked attack on Ukraine. It has to be said that people in Russia who will have been protesting have been arrested, and there are now increasingly harsh punishments for people into jail if you are part of a protest in Russia, in any part of Russia. You can be sentenced to 15 years in jail simply for protesting. This is another photo of the area around the St. Sophia Cathedral in Kyiv, and you see the Dnieper River and all of the development, residential and industrial, on the other bank of the Dnieper. I have been to this region, to this city, several times, and it's just something quite astonishing to think that war is closing in on Kyiv, and that one can imagine that the intentions of President Putin are to capture Kyiv and to force it into some kind of relationship with Moscow, where Moscow controls the government and all of the ways in which people will be living. This photo sends a chill into my soul, and probably to yours as well. It's a chilly photograph, of course, because it shows Putin in his iconic outdoor pool in front of a ice crucifix. The fact that Putin is imitating the kind of the religious beliefs that are to be held within the Russian Orthodox Church, and also the fact that Putin is increasingly deranged by virtue, probably in part, of the impact of the anabolic steroids that he has been consuming in his bodybuilding. In any event, the incongruity of this photo of Putin in front of the cross, given that we know that he is being condemned by religious leaders within Ukraine, with some within Russia, although they do this at their peril, but it's certainly across the world. So what I want to emphasize this afternoon is that we are living in a time when we have the conjunction of three existential crises. On the one hand, the global pandemic continues across many parts of the world. It is not the case that the pandemic has ended for many countries and many people. And it's worth pointing out that in Russia alone, more than 1 million people have died from COVID-19, almost up to the level of within the United States. And Ukraine also has experienced many deaths from the pandemic. And this impact upon public health, particularly at a time of this terrible conflict and the economic decline associated with it, is really dreadful. Then we have the climate emergency, and following on from the COP26 conference in Glasgow in November 2021, we know that extreme weather events are accelerating. We know from the warnings offered by the international climate groups that population movements and national and international aid budgets are going to be hugely stretched and strained by the increasing severity and frequency of extreme weather events. So with the movement of people who will be escaping from intense heat or intense flooding, if we think about that and the atrocious state of the refugees in their hundreds of thousands and now probably close to 1.5 million, if not more, then this apocalyptic invasion by Russia into Ukraine adds to a period of unbelievable, almost unique international crises, which coming together will create huge problems. The comment by the Russian revolutionary leader Leon Trotsky back in the period after the Russian Revolution in 1917 is particularly relevant at this time. You may not be interested in war, said Trotsky, but war is certainly interested in you. And we have to recognize that this is something that can be echoed by other quotations. A well-known saying is that Russians never forget, while they believe that the West never remembers. So I'd like to say some things about the origins and the antecedents to the present invasion of Ukraine. The truth of the matter is that after Ukraine achieved its independence in 1991, following on from the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the then dissolution of the Soviet Union, Ukrainian joy and hopes, thinking that they were going to be recreating a lot of their historical past in terms of the way in which Ukraine was a very significant part of what were called the Rus people. All of that unfolded at a time when, after the 9/11 attacks in the United States, NATO was put on alert for the consequences of the attacks by entering into Afghanistan, invading into Afghanistan in pursuit of bin Laden. And then in 2003, and in my view, extremely unwisely, the invasion of Iraq. What had happened in the period just before the 9/11 attacks in 1999 was that Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic had become member states of Ukraine. And that, if you would like to recognize, is one of the key areas of Putin's anger and distrust of the West, as he would say. And then in 2004, NATO expanded its membership by a further 7 countries, including the 3 Baltic states, Slovakia, Slovenia, and also Romania and Bulgaria. All of this actually created potentially a huge amount of tensions. But at this period, as I remember well, since I was very much involved in all of these developments and discussions, NATO and Russia had in 2001, in May 2001, had in Rome agreed a new format for having discussions between NATO and Russia. And Putin, who had come to power in 1999, after Boris Yeltsin, the previous president, could no longer continue, Putin was seemingly agreeable to the setting up of the NATO-Russia Council, in which the ad hoc working groups would try to provide some kind of basis for exchange of views and even some kind of common agreed programs between NATO and Russia. Russia at that time was in the first decade of the 21st century was also extremely worried about Islamist terrorism, and out of the North Caucasus endured some very serious attacks, which made Putin extremely interested in some kind of cooperation with NATO in terms of dealing with these attacks as they might impact upon Russia. NATO was willing to consider these kinds of arrangements in return for Putin and Russia facilitating flights into Afghanistan from airfields in the southern part of Russia and elsewhere. The key thing about this period is that it seemed to put to rest the famous statement by the first Secretary General of NATO, a man by the name of Lord Ismay, a British diplomat, who said in 1952, NATO was founded in 1949, Ismay said that the point of NATO was to keep the Russians down, or keep the Russians out, keep the Germans down, and keep the Americans in. And that slogan at this point in time, given that the Russians are so firmly entrenched in Ukraine with many fears that there could be some decision to move elsewhere, including Moldova. And of course, if the Russians were to enter into any of the any of the Baltic states or into Poland, for example, then this would trigger a conflict between NATO and Russia based upon NATO's Article 5. And in my view, this is perfectly good reason, unfortunately, not to implement a no-fly zone over Ukraine. The prospect for a tactical nuclear weapon exchange between NATO and Russia is almost impossible to think about, because it would certainly lead to the destruction of many parts of some cities, maybe in Russia and in NATO countries, and millions would probably die. So in 2002, I set off in September that year on a diplomatic visit to the Russian Far East, where I was going to announce in some conferences and in some speaking sessions that there was going to be a new understanding between Russia and NATO. When I arrived in Khabarovsk, east of Siberia and right close to the Chinese border on the Russian Far East, I gave a speech to the local regional parliament, the Khabarovsky Krai. And while I was speaking with a translator, my Russian is not sufficiently good just to give extemporaneous talks in Russian, a number of the deputies in the regional parliament stood up and shouted that I should be arrested for being a spy. That actually set the scene for me traveling on the train that night, on the last leg of the Trans-Siberian Express, and meeting up with a Russian naval officer from the Russian Pacific Fleet, who also wondered what I was doing in that part of Russia, and recalling that his grandfather had been part of the Red Army that threw out the foreigners and the White Army in 1923. So I had tried to explain to him, because he looked a very powerful man, that I was there on a peace and goodwill visit, and I repeated these things when I arrived in Vladivostok. Well, thereafter, the relationship between NATO and Russia really became frosty, although the frostiness was initially to do with the dispute that Russia had with Ukraine over gas and the fees that Ukraine was supposed to be paying to Gazprom for the transit rights for pipelines across Ukraine. And Russia tightened its hold over Ukraine's energy sector and threatened to turn off the taps of gas, which meant that a number of the NATO countries, and notably Germany, Italy, but also Slovakia and Hungary, who were incredibly dependent upon Russian gas for their energy. And frankly, the same is still the case, as we are in the midst of a full-blown energy crisis with escalating energy prices. So this kind of challenge to Ukraine that Russia used as a lever to try to get Ukraine to come into line politically in terms of its ambitions became a significant element in what we now see. The crisis in Ukraine really erupted, particularly in 2004. I went to speak in Ukraine in the autumn of 2004, just before the so-called Orange Revolution, when supporters of Yushchenko, who was one of the candidates for the presidency, and people who were against Yanukovych, who was the Russian-supported other candidate for the elections, they protested what they thought were fraudulent election results. And from that point on, politics in Ukraine became enormously complicated and difficult. And when I made a number of visits to take part and speak and sometimes chair meetings of the NATO Ukraine Commission Joint Working Group on Economic Security, you could feel the tensions in the air that were accelerating. And this all became particularly clear to see when, following the NATO Bucharest summit in 2006, George Bush, the American president, had seemingly signaled that Ukraine and Georgia might become member states of NATO, something that he didn't really know anything about, and which horrified the presidents of Germany and of France particularly. But in any event, in 2008, Russia invaded two regions of Georgia, and that was the first evidence of the Russian bears willingness to use military force to deal with insurgency as it saw it. Following on from this, in 2014, after the pro-Russian Ukrainian President Yanukovych had been overthrown and he had fled to Russia, the Independence Square, the Maidan demonstrations in Kyiv led to a kind of a backlash from Russia when it invaded Crimea and supported the pro-separatist areas of Donetsk and Lugansk, and the Minsk peace process, which had been intended to bring some kind of a rapprochement between Russia and Ukraine and countries from the West that were brokering this, all collapsed. The past is undoubtedly a tragic prologue. The fighting that is taking place and intensifying in Ukraine is witnessing the imbalance between Russian and Ukrainian forces and capabilities, but it is absolutely correct to say that Ukrainian forces have been fighting incredibly courageously and with great determination to protect their nation, and Russian forces have been bogged down in some areas around Ukraine, particularly outside of Kyiv, but also going down towards the south and in the horrible shelling of Mariupol and the encirclement of the city of Kherson. It's undoubtedly the case that Ukraine and its valiant defense needs desperately support from Western countries, from NATO countries, to provide more not only defensive weapon systems, ground-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft systems, but also probably some combat aircraft that maybe could come from Poland in the form of MiG-29 planes that would be understood by Ukrainian pilots. Poland in turn would expect to receive from the United States F-15 fighters to bolster its own defenses. I've already mentioned that the causes of this conflict are many and deep, but undoubtedly when one listens to Putin and Foreign Secretary Lavrov, who I heard several times speaking in NATO headquarters in the past, one understands that the pretext for this invasion is the need to reconfigure Euro-Atlantic security to take account of what Putin and Lavrov say is the unacceptable domination of Russia. As Lavrov said at an Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe meeting earlier that week, no country can strengthen their security at the expense of others, and the criticism that NATO was bolstering its security in the North Atlantic space at the expense of Russia. Well, there's no doubt about it that although NATO has been very conscious of increasing Russian attitudes and militancy and became increasingly alarmed by the way in which troops were massing on the borders close to the pro-separatist, now allegedly independent oblasts or republics of Lugansk and Donetsk. It's been quite a terrible shock, to say the least, not only to Ukraine, but the whole of the world, that Russia has launched this invasion. The role of the close advisors to Putin, the so-called Stavka and the Siloviki, have now turned Russia into the kind of state that Germany was in when the Nazis seized power from 1933, 1934 onwards. And the control and suppression of information is complete. This is accompanied by the Faustian pact, which exists between Putin and the close circle of advisors, and organized crime, the mafia in Russia, which is immense, and also the oligarchs and the way in which they have been patrons of energy and banking And the billionaires in the oligarchs have been looking on anxiously at the sanctions which are being applied increasingly by the West on Russia. Young people who are the hope for the future are absolutely outraged by this brutality which is being inflicted upon Ukrainian families and people. Many young people in Russia believe that the Ukrainian population, they're kindred spirits, and anybody who might stand up to President Putin and the Kremlin, someone like Alexei Navalny, is in jail and has only limited ability to reach out, given the completely controlling way the Russian state is now influencing information and limiting social media. So, as I've already mentioned, the rise and fall of the relationship between Putin and NATO can be understood in all of the elements that I mentioned previously. And I think that what I'd like to emphasize in this slide about the pivotal pulses and critical fissures between the breakdown between NATO and Russia is the way in which global geoeconomics and geopolitical energy relations are playing out. And we have also the incredibly important role of China and its relationship with Russia as part of the wider implications of the Ukraine crisis. China is adopting a very complicated stance. On the one hand, it is supporting the need for humanitarian measures, given the brutality and the increasing scale of the conflict. On the other hand, President Xi Jinping, when he spoke to Vladimir Putin at the Winter Olympic Games in China in January and in February, China refuses so far to condemn this violence and attack. China actually is thinking that the West and NATO are not only encroaching on Russia, but also China has been very agitated by what it sees as the undesirable influence of NATO and the United States, particularly in the South China Sea. And China has a problem here because, on the one hand, it certainly has articulated that it believes that no nation state should be invaded by another and should be therefore subject to the kind of attacks that Russia is making. But on the other hand, China has this one China policy towards Taiwan, and that is causing within the Chinese Foreign Ministry considerable problems. Sanctions are now increasingly the big question about what can NATO and the West and the European Union do in terms of imposing meaningful sanctions in banking and in business and in a whole range of sectors that would undermine the Russian economy. The recognition, of course, is that these sanctions will have feedback and detrimental effects upon the economies of the United Kingdom, of the European Union, and the United States. And the big question is what's to be done about sanctions on the energy sector, on oil and gas, because of the concerns about whether in the short term there can be adequate substitutes for Russian energy supplies, which are so dominant in a number of the countries within the European Union and NATO. And the longer term question about what to do in terms of substitution of Russian gas and Russian oil will be bound up in the big questions about whether fossil fuels can be substituted for by green energy and what will be the time scale. I do not think this problem is going to be solved any time within the next several years. So Russia is responding to all of the sanctions which are being imposed upon it by planning for autarky, that is to say self-sufficiency, and drawing on the somewhere around $650 billion savings that it accumulated, given that now it is not possible to exchange Russian rubles outside of Russia for foreign currencies. It is also making significant efforts to boost its collective security treaty organization, as well as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, so that Russia is seeking to try to persuade like-minded countries like Belarus and countries in Central Asia and China to take up a more aggressive stance towards the West, as reflected in the European Union and NATO. So we see here the constellation of countries that make up the European Union and NATO. The United Kingdom is erroneously shown as a member of the European Union. Actually, that raises an interesting question about the United Kingdom's engagement with the European Union in the weeks and months and years to come. Germany has shown the way in recent days with its decision to announce a 100 billion euros defense fund as a special measure to boost its defense capabilities. And it is going to be extremely interesting to see what kind of bilateral or multilateral arrangements the United Kingdom takes part in with countries in the European Union. Please notice in this map the vulnerability of Finland and Sweden, who are European Union members, but unlike Norway, which is only a NATO member, they are not part of NATO. But their juxtaposition to Russia, together with the countries in the Baltic states, make them particularly vulnerable. And there are growing demands within Finnish and Swedish parliamentary discussions that these two countries should significantly boost their defense spending. Russia has warned both of them that it would regard any such increasing posture in military activity as a kind of a signal of hostility towards Russia, with all kinds of military and political consequences. So every day the map is changing in terms of Russia's domination of Ukraine. And in my view, we cannot expect to see any great change in this profile for weeks and months to come. One thing I would say is that the evidence comes from various quarters, including open source intelligence as well as classified intelligence, that Russian forces are having a much more difficult time than they might have anticipated in this invasion. Young Russian conscripts have complained of being, when they're captured, they've complained of being misled. They thought they were on some kind of exercises. They were not told they were going to face such fierce opposition from the Ukrainian people and Ukrainian armed forces. And I believe that we're going to see an escalation, tragically, in the violence that Russia will inflict, since its strategy for dealing with Ukraine seems to be bolstering Ukrainian resistance. And the likelihood is that Russia will send in its own intelligence officers from the FSB and the military intelligence GRU in order to try and cower, intimidate, and suppress Ukrainian citizens in terms of their commitment to the Ukrainian cause. One of the big consequences of the invasion is that food prices globally are going through the roof. And that's easy to see when you look at the share that Russia and Ukraine have in important commodities such as sunflower seed and cottonseed, wheat and barley, and so on. The geography of post USSR Russia includes the Kaliningrad area, which is close to what is known as the Suwalki Gap, and also includes the occupation of the eastern side of Moldova, Transnistria. These are Russian-speaking areas, and they demonstrate the mounting tensions across all of the border areas of the European Union and NATO. The argument that Russia has advanced about the need for recognition of the oblasts or regions of Donetsk and Lugansk and Kharkiv, and that is because they are above 50% Russian speaking. Having been in the Kyiv region, it's certainly true that people in the big cities to the west of Ukraine speak Russian and Ukrainian, but it's also true that as you go further west towards Lviv, most citizens do not wish to have anything to do with the speaking of Russian. So my own personal experiences of speaking in Ukraine, the last time I spoke at the Razumkov Center was in 2017, and I look back at that meeting and the people that I met and I knew, and I know that a number of colleagues have fled towards the Polish border, towards Lviv, and also down towards the south. The exodus into Poland and Moldova is just unparalleled. During the great crisis of the civil war in Syria from 2011 up until the present day, over 1 million refugees fled from the country during that period. More than 1.5 million refugees have fled from Ukraine into Poland and Moldova, heading on to Germany and beyond in just over a week. So to bring my presentation somewhat to a close, what can we see looking ahead? The global economic impact of this invasion by Russia into Ukraine is absolutely unprecedented. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, who are seeking to try to discipline Russia, I suspect without little success, but the increasing price of gas and oil prices heading well above $130, now probably above $140, and the disrupted global supply chains lead to really difficult business and economic conditions. Many companies have already indicated that they are leaving Russia. They are ending their involvement with Russian businesses and partnerships. There's the big reputational risk of this happening. It's just really in the energy sector that Russia continues to have some hold over Western involvement, and that of course provides the revenues which help to support the Russian budget and Russian military spending. But the suspension of SWIFT and the ending of currency transactions is really critical. Some people have talked about cryptocurrencies, Bitcoins and that kind of cryptocurrency as being a solution. In my judgment as an economist of some years, that will not be sufficient. What about defense spending? I think it's clear that NATO member countries will be increasing their defense spending. I think in the case of Germany, that historically had only been about 1.5%, Germany is going to boost its defense spending to at least 2.5%. And I think many countries within the NATO alliance will be pushing their defense spending well above 2%. United States, as a reference point here, is 3.5%. Obviously, the consequences of such an increase is very much down to the opportunity cost, the trade-off. This kind of spending increase, if we think about what the United Kingdom is going to do, will undoubtedly mean smaller budgets in other important sectors of the UK economy, health, education, transport, such sectors, without there being rising taxes. And taxes are already projected to rise in the April budget to be announced by the Chancellor Rishi Sunak. So I think that what I've just said is clarified by this particular slide. The financial and economic convulsions from the Russian invasion are going to be deep, they're going to be long, and it's almost impossible to predict how this is all going to unfold. As I've mentioned earlier, the response from Russia and also from India, that has a big reliance on Russian military hardware, which enables India to feel some kind of protection from what it sees as Chinese aggression or potential aggression on the Indian-China border. And that's also true with India's fear of attack from Pakistan. So the global defense budgets from 2021, we will see a substantial increase in a number of these countries. And it'll be just very interesting to see how much Germany increases, France. What will Russia do, given its financial difficulties now? And what about the United Kingdom, which, as you can see, is ranked after China and the United States as number 3 in defense budgets. I've already mentioned the near-term consequences, the vulnerability of the Black Sea region. If Odessa is captured, this will cause further convulsions. Turkey's relationship with Russia and NATO is complicated, and the closing of the Bosphorus Straits to shipping means that, given that we have the so-called war enact, the Montreux Convention, Turkey will not be permitting any Russian ships to be going through the Bosphorus Straits unless they're returning to Russia, and Ukrainian ships are all at port. Many countries are feeling incredibly uncertain and fearful as to how the irrationality and how the madness of Vladimir Putin may impact upon them both militarily and economically. So I've mentioned about Russian gas in Europe and the way in which, for example, the Nord Stream 2 project has now been cancelled by Germany. It wasn't up and running, Nord Stream 1 was, but you get some idea from this slide about the pipelines that crisscross Europe and also go through the Black Sea region. So I'm going to finish my presentation by just demonstrating a complex slide showing a range of pipeline projects that Russia has engaged in. The slide mentions the problem of permafrost and actually drilling and discovering oil in particular regions. For me, the big question that I'd like to leave with all of you is, what is this energy crisis with the prices going, upwards every day, and with the consequences for British business, affordability of energy supplies, British consumers? All these price rises are going to affect transportation costs, food prices, and of course, how much you pay for your petrol at the pump. So I thank you very much for listening to this presentation, and I hope to have another opportunity to elaborate further as the crisis extends itself into the coming weeks and months and deepens the degree of instability. But for the time being, I would just like to say that this is, as I mentioned right at the very beginning, the most serious global crisis since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. At that time, I went to a cemetery near where I lived in Swindon, Wiltshire, and I said a prayer because I thought I might land up in that cemetery the following day. So without trying to be over dramatic, we have to pray and hope that there will be no nuclear escalation in this crisis. Thank you. That's the end of my slides.
Adrian, thank you very much. Rebecca, can I just ask, do we have any questions in the comments?
We do. We have one question, Adrian. So, albeit different circumstances in terms of the aggressors and defenders, we're reminded in this conflict of what happened in Chechnya in the early 2000s. What are your thoughts on whether Russia might do the same or similar to Kiev, Ukraine?
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you for the question. The conflict in Chechnya, which was really the first moment for Putin to demonstrate the power of his personality and the power of his fist. Putin came from being, the senior figure in the KGB in Leningrad before he went to Germany, so he speaks perfectly fluent German as well as Russian. When he came to power in 1999 after Yeltsin, he took the disturbances in the North Caucasus, including Chechnya, as a threat of Islamist terrorism. And he, at that time, when the NATO-Russia Council was formed in May 2002, Putin, thought that NATO and Russia could agree to fight against terrorism, the famous, infamous George Bush war on terrorism. So for some time, there was some limited evidence that there was going to be a kind of a rapprochement, a kind of an understanding and cooperation. I took part in any number of meetings of the NATO-Russia Council ad hoc working group on macroeconomic finance and budgeting, which might sound a bit esoteric to you, but it actually reflected upon Russia's concerns at that point in time with its very impoverished finances. So the Chechen clamping down and the sheer violence that was inflicted in the different areas, Grozny and elsewhere in Chechnya, were a clear signal of what Putin was capable of doing. But Putin thought at that point that given what the NATO alliance was doing in putting forces into Afghanistan, and then, of course, the infamous invasion of Iraq, that he thought there was some moral equivalence in all of this. And so he did not believe that NATO could be particularly critical of how Russia was conducting its own affairs and interests. Maybe, Rebecca, I could just add here, Syria. So the Syria incursion, the Syria adventure by Putin, which was designed to support President Bashar al-Assad, who remains in power, amazingly, after 10 years with the Alawite minority group in Syria. And the fact that Russia then was able to secure Latakia and another city in Syria as a port for Russian Black Sea vessels, and was a very significant demonstration of Putin's belief that he had to be very proactive in resisting not only NATO expansion, but resisting the way in which NATO was engaging in other countries, such as Afghanistan and Iraq.
Thank you, Adrian. Very comprehensive answer. Does anybody else have any questions for either Nicholas or Adrian at this stage? No, the room is very quiet. Or we do have, I believe, another question. I'll hand over to Rebecca.
So a question from Mark Nichols. I understand that Ukraine has tried to join NATO since the early 2000s, but was vetoed by certain countries, Germany and France being two. In the last few years, it was becoming more likely they could join. Do you think that Putin acted at this moment in time due to this? And do you think that an invasion would have happened as we see it today if they had been successful in joining?
Thank you for the question again, and thank you, Rebecca. So just very briefly, because I could speak for an hour on this issue, since I was much involved in the kind of unfolding discussions. To become a member of NATO, rather similar to becoming a member of the European Union, you had to satisfy a whole list of conditions for membership, in order to meet the criteria, which include, as Nicholas made earlier reference to these kinds of things, included democratic accountability, agreement to abide by the rule of law, and there's a whole list of issues. I took part in some of these membership action plan events in the Baltic states as well as in Romania, and Ukraine becoming proactive with its NATO-Ukraine Commission was always interested in having dialogue with NATO in Kyiv as well as in Brussels, but at no point was there really any clear indication that given the vast amount of corruption in Ukraine from its own oligarchs and those that were sharing Russian Ukrainian business interests, there was never going to be any real prospect of that. What was really happening here was that NATO was not, you could argue it was flirting with Ukraine, and that may be true. But in 2008, George Bush at the NATO Bucharest summit tried to signal in his complete naivety that, you know, NATO, that Ukraine and Georgia could join NATO. And France and Germany and others made it completely transparently clear that George Bush didn't know what he was talking about. Putin took this kind of development as a personal affront, given that Russia and Ukraine were bitterly arguing and disagreeing over outstanding debts from Ukraine to Russia on the transit of energy. And so thereafter, in 2009, Putin decided that it was time to really flex his muscles in this nonsense of Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO. And as you will all recall, or not as the case might be, he invaded two regions in Georgia, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. I remember this vividly because I was asked to attend the meeting of the North Atlantic Council with the Secretary General and all of the ambassadors in August when this crisis erupted. I was asked to give a briefing about energy security implications for NATO, and this turned out to be, you know, the postponement of my summer holiday, which had been carefully negotiated since you had to make sure there were a certain number of people in the room, or sorry, in the organization at headquarters. From that point on, although there was some feeble attempt to re-engineer some kind of reset button between NATO and Russia, the combination of the global economic crisis after 2009 and the growing unrest within Ukraine over its leadership, therefore prompted or certainly contributed to the invasion of Crimea in 2014, which Nicholas referred to earlier. So from 2014 onwards, the question I think Sam was really asking, would it have made any difference if Ukraine was in NATO? Well, that of course is what the Ukrainians have been saying. And of course, if Ukraine was a member of NATO, then the so-called no-fly zone debate to protect people, families in Ukraine from Russian bombing and Russian strafing from the air, well, that would have been a different kind of debate because it would have led to the breakout of World War III, absolutely categorically, as was actually interestingly projected in a book by the former NATO Deputy Supreme Military Commander Richard Shiref in the coming war with Russia. So I think that NATO member states have always regarded Ukraine and Georgia as poison chalices. It's not that there isn't any interest in trying to promote dialogue and cooperation, but they have always thought that Ukraine and Georgia didn't meet the criteria, and enough member states were not prepared to entertain the prospect of the exchange of tactical nuclear weapons, which, just to finish this particular point, one of my big fears at the moment, as we are here today, is that if there was an unintended or partially intended attack by Russia on one of the Baltic states or Poland or Romania near Moldova, then this would trigger a military response undoubtedly from NATO. And then if the Russians fired or decided to try to destroy Tallinn or Riga or Vilnius, God forbid that they would think to go anything else, but then we would be launched onto a major unprecedented conflict, the like of which has not been seen since the destructive days of World War II.
Thank you, Adrian. And I just think we have one more question, Rebecca.
We do, and probably apt given given the timing that we've got about 5 minutes left, Adrian. What are your thoughts on how or when this might end?
I think, Rebecca, and thanks again for the question, that and you know, I think having Nicholas make some remark on this, I think China is key here. China is the most powerful economic state in the world other than the United States, and the relationship between the USA and China needs to be reset. Biden made some kind of signal to this in the State of the Union address that he gave yesterday. But if I think that only China would Putin and his inner circle listen to, and I think that Ukraine could be persuaded to engage in some kind of diplomatic exchange. It probably will mean that Ukraine has to become, ironically, people have been talking about the Finlandization of Ukraine. I think it's ironic because I think Finland might be on the verge of joining NATO. But again, it would take time for Finland and Sweden to go down that road. But I think the Chinese might well be able to persuade Putin to stop the violence and to kind of encourage Putin to recognize that Ukraine, you know, cannot be wiped off the map. It cannot be completely dominated. This is not the Cold War all over again. And I would hope that Xi Jinping and others, Chinese Foreign Ministry, might well be able to do this in the coming week. So that's my optimistic hope. I don't know what Nicholas thinks, but I'm not ever so optimistic that that's going to happen. What do you think, Nicholas?
Well, very briefly, I was more optimistic on the fact that they abstained in the in the UN resolution. China didn't vote against it, which is nice, which puts them alongside South Africa and India and other countries that abstained for perfectly good reasons. Slightly depressing today to see the announcement from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesman, Wang Wenbing. He said that any suggestion that China had been telling Russia what to do was completely mistaken and was fake news. They had not advised Russia not to attack Ukraine. And he said that as if that was a thing to be proud of. And also said that, you know, speculation that China is trying to support one party or the other is also incorrect. But holistically, that's perhaps just a continuation of the line of, you know, we don't interfere in other countries' affairs. I think China internally, certainly from what I see of WeChat communications, people are not being censored for, and they're not having their WeChat posts removed, and never for saying things like lamenting the war in Ukraine. At the same time, you get mad nationalists who are saying, isn't it great there's a war in Ukraine? So it's very difficult, but perhaps a bit more optimistic than a month ago.
I agree with you totally, Nicholas. And just a brief comment about the religious angle in this. It's very well worth looking at the kind of the crypto-fascist view that Putin has about the Russian Orthodox Church. And in fact, the whole historical cultural relationship between the Russian Orthodox Church and the supposed breakaway Ukrainian Orthodox Church. This kind of religious element goes deep back into the history of the formation of the Rus and what happened thereafter. Kyiv was a kind of a thriving city when Moscow and other Russian cities were just agricultural fields. And there's no doubt about it that the patriarchy in Moscow, the Russian Orthodox Church, has been supine and compliant in giving some succor to Putin. In my slide pack, you would be able to see an astonishing photograph of Putin sitting in a cold, icy outdoor swimming pool in front of an ice formation of the crucifix.
Adrian, thank you. And Nicholas, thank you very much. And thank you to everybody that's attended today. Just to add on, we will be putting the recording of this onto the website, and we will also include Adrian's presentation pack. But if anybody has any further questions, then please feel free to reach out to any of us. But thank you very much, and hopefully we'll see you next week at our next seminar.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you, everybody, Rebecca, Anna, and thanks all participants for the questions.